Welcome to episode 2 of Tapestry Reassembled. I'm Edie Song.
And I'm Kate Ross. In this episode we're going to talk more about the ideas that a centrist third candidate for president in 2024 can bring to the American people to really address and solve long-standing issues the country faces.
In the last episode we talked about spending cuts and government efficiencies, and delayed to this episode a discussion of the rest of the government reform and economic policy ideas, as well as education reforms that could generate populist support. First up is tax policy.
I think it should include both individual and business tax reforms. And the main thing about tax policy that has to be put in place to meet the goal of surpluses is getting rid of unfairness. Creating a minimum effective tax rate or meter would solve this. The more you make, the more you pay. What I mean is that the tax rate would increase based on increasing gross income. That means you add up wages, salaries, interest, dividends, business income, and capital gains, and reset the tax brackets to increase the total income tax revenue significantly.
So you're saying that the current alternative minimum tax rates will be replaced with the meter? I see how that could make things better. Even with the AMT, there are people who pay a lower tax rate because they use tax loopholes to get out of it. I think we could keep the brackets for taxable income that we have, but if the tax that someone's going to pay is below the gross income levels meter, then they would pay the meter. What do you think are good numbers to use for the meter tax rates?
The highest should be 30%. They're paying less than 20% now, so we've got to raise it. What I think we also need that's probably going to be controversial is that the lowest income people should also have to pay taxes, so that everyone has skin in the game. But it should be 1% for the poorest, so they know that they're on the hook like the rest of us to get the debt paid off. The brackets between will be structured in a way that total income tax revenue goes up enough to start paying off that debt, but doesn't make the total tax paid for the folks in the middle class to go up massively.
Wow, that's kind of revolutionary. You're saying that the middle class will have to pay more and the earned income tax credit for low-income households would be eliminated?
Yeah, and that's as it should be. We're all Americans, and whatever debt the government has taken on belongs to all of us. The middle class has benefited from a strong economy for years, and can afford to pay a little more. Since the higher income households have benefited a lot more, they'll be paying a lot more. But even those who have the lowest incomes ought to pay at least a little bit, since the government works for them as well as everybody else. The fact is that the EITC is a big government giveaway that acts like it's a charity when the government shouldn't be in the charity business. Charity should come from charities.
I guess I see what you mean. If we can get rid of welfare for businesses, like we said earlier, we can get rid of it for people too. That's why things got better for folks after the 1996 Welfare Reform Act. Welfare is like a drug. As long as someone is dependent, they'll never get off of it. And look how long we've gone with more jobs available than the number of people around to fill them. While we had all those available jobs, we kept on paying people to stay home. But for fairness, it seems to me that there ought to be a corporate meter as well, don't you think?
You bet, with rates progressive up to 15% for the companies with the highest revenues, and a minimum of 1%. The fact is that companies price their products and services to include the cost of income tax in the price, so it just gets passed along anyway. But the nice thing about this idea is that the huge companies like Amazon and ExxonMobil and others can't make billions of dollars and yet still pay nothing in taxes. That kind of thing pisses people off.
Yeah, and it happens for wealthy individual taxpayers as well. That's why a common sense solution is to close the carried interest loophole, and any other loopholes that benefit only the wealthiest taxpayers. Especially because of the meter, any loophole that's used on 5% or less of all income tax returns should be eventually removed.
And for people who aren't wealthy, and are still in the middle class or earning even less than that, there's another common sense change that makes sense. Exemptions and the standard deduction should be indexed to the cost of living depending on which metropolitan statistical area the household is in. It makes no sense to have the same standard deduction whether you live in Manhattan in New York or Manhattan in Kansas. The cost of living is way different.
Another tax change that makes sense is to undo the estate tax exclusion limits that went into effect under Bush in 2001 and were extended under President Obama. If those taxes had been in place for the past 23 years, the government might have collected trillions, and instead our debt went up by trillions. This would create greater equity between the households who paid estate taxes before 2001 and those today who pay much less. Given that wealth in the U.S. has gone up so much, this will generate tons of revenues for surpluses, and at the same time combat wealth inequality.
And it doesn't have to destroy small inheritances. There can be a threshold that makes sense, like not taxing estates smaller than twice the average estate of all of the people who died 2 or 3 years earlier, however long it takes to gather up the data. That's probably going to be estates below about 500,000, at least, and for the estates larger than that the rate can go up the larger the estate. The candidate doesn't have to be the only one coming up with possible changes like that to tax policy to achieve surpluses. They can ask Democrats and Republicans what other changes could be made that both sides could agree on.
So we've covered spending and taxes. What should they do on the other two tools, trade policy and regulations? To me, trade policy that makes sense reduces trade imbalances. New trade agreements ought to provide for balanced trade, adjusted when things get too out of whack. That means we use tariffs when the U.S. has the deficit, and the trading partner uses them when they have the deficit. Or maybe we can give them humanitarian or military assistance of value when the U.S. is running a surplus.
Makes sense to me. So does getting rid of regulations that cost U.S. businesses too much compared to other countries. Unless they're solving another major voter issue, they should be scrapped or changed to be more in line with what other developed nations use. That would have a lower negative impact on U.S. companies, and increase the number of good-paying jobs that Americans could get.
What do you think would be other regulatory changes? I think it's hard to think of many that as a group would have a meaningful impact across the economy. Although there's probably some in the climate change area that can be scaled back to still make progress in reducing carbon emissions without destroying American jobs, since many wild-eyed environmentalists have gone beyond what's reasonable.
You're right. I mean, President Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act, which they rarely talk about in inflation reduction terms but usually in terms of it being the biggest climate change legislation ever. The problem is that scientific analysis of it showed that after spending trillions of dollars, it'll lower global temperatures by less than 0.2 degrees Celsius over the next 75 years. Scaling back those and other regulations will cut costs of monitoring and enforcement, yet still won't destroy the planet.
There's probably other areas of the economy and government spending that can be dealt with, but the ones we've talked about are probably the biggest hot-button issues that a centrist third candidate should propose.
And the nice thing about that coming from such a person is that it's not easy for the Republicans or Democrats to complain about solving the problems with them, because it's not like they're giving the opposition political party a victory. That's something that stands in the way of any legislative or policy changes in today's environment.
Let's turn now to the contentious issues of education, healthcare, and immigration reform. In discussions about our educational system, many times the issues of critical race theory and teaching about LGBT equality take center stage. And on the right, calls to eliminate the Department of Education are frequently put forward.
And those are important to discuss and resolve. But two other aspects of the state of education in the U.S. are more destructive to our long-term national economic security and national unity: academic attainment and student loan debt forgiveness. Both deserve bold solutions.
Our failing K-12 schools are typically found in low-income and low-tax base areas. As a national economic security issue, this requires federal intervention to confront historical inequities. A bold proposal to advance equity and strengthen our population's education level is to devote massive resources to the worst-performing districts for years to come, and not try to slap a Band-Aid on things or to think that the problem is unsolvable.
A bold centrist idea would be to replace the worst-performing 5,000 districts with charter schools, 1,000 per year for the next 5 years across the country. Yes, that's federal intervention into what has traditionally been a local issue, but the reality is, combining all of the negative effects that result means that there's a national implication of local failures.
The federally funded charter schools will take over for the existing publicly funded schools, and revolutionize the educational experience for those students. And there's a way to ensure that the solution is equitable and not ridiculous. The per-pupil budget for each charter school will be equal to the most recent annual operating per-pupil budget of the best-funded school district within 100 miles of the failing district. The budget will continue to match that benchmark for the succeeding 3 years, then 75% for 3 years, then 50% for 3 years, then 25% for 3 years. As the budget steps down, state and local spending will take the place of federal spending.
After 12 years, the local tax base and economy will have improved sufficiently for the federal government to stop intervening, and state and local governments will take over the challenge of making the charter school district self-sustaining for the long term. The cost of this program will be offset by eliminating all federal government grants made to all institutions of higher learning across the country where the total institution endowment exceeds $1 billion.
But Americans would want to know what these charter schools will be teaching. The answer is that the Department of Education needs to maintain a laser-like focus on setting common standards for all schools across the country for what should be learned at each grade level. Those standards should match the educational performance seen in the developed nations whose students are ahead of us in academic achievement.
We've got to close the gap. Our economic vitality and long-term national security interests demand it.
The reason why student loans are a major issue is because it's been terribly divisive for the Biden-Harris administration to force the American people to absorb $200 billion in student loans into the national debt. That transfer of debt from the borrowers to people who'd paid off their own debt or had never even gone to college is an imposed tax without being treated as a tax. And it's also rightly criticized for being used to buy votes.
Instead, student loan origination should be taken out of government hands, and instead become the responsibility of financial aid offices in each college or university, working with financial institutions and the individual student and their family. Loans will be tied to the educational institution, not the government. The Department of Education will still provide Pell Grants and other grant programs, but will no longer be involved in student loans.
Colleges and universities will be encouraged to adjust their prices for their courses in each degree program to reflect the earning power of students with that degree after graduation, rather than one-size-fits-all tuition per credit hour. For example, if a history major is forecast to make $2 million in lifetime earnings with a Bachelor of Arts degree, and an engineering major is forecast to make $6 million in lifetime earnings with a Bachelor of Science degree, engineering classes should cost 3 times as much as history classes.
Adopting this idea would align student loan debt with forecast career earnings and thus be more affordable for each student. For current student loan borrowers, while there is understandable sympathy, it only applies to the extent that they were misled into irrational levels of debt relative to their ability to pay it back by getting good-paying jobs. Borrowers can report the circumstances where they believe they were misled, and if they can make a valid case, then their debt will be reduced by an appropriate amount, with the forgiven debt assigned to the degree-granting institution who misled the individual borrower.
All other borrowers and their families are expected to accept responsibility and accountability for their actions. They chose to sign up for the debt, and it's up to them to pay it. Neither the U.S. government nor any other taxpayer is financially accountable for bad choices by these individuals.
And all of the previously forgiven debt needs to be unforgiven, in order to reduce the federal debt. Nobody gets a free ride, no matter how much they whine and complain about how hard it is for them. Personal accountability creates personal strength. Other Americans know that, unlike that Capitol Hill staffer making $80,000 per year who thanked Joe Biden for forgiving his $8,000 student loan, when he had the money to take trips and share Instagrams of fancy dinners.
Government intervention into what should be private transactions can sometimes be good. In the case of student loans, it was bad. It was both good and bad in the case of health care. We have a mixed bag of healthcare system pros and cons in the U.S.
I think we should leave it there, and take that up in the next podcast. For now, this is Kate Ross and Edie Song for Tapestry Reassembled. Take care and God bless.